This is the story of the one. As a custodial supervisor at a high school, he knows that during cold and flu season, germs spread fast. It's why he partners with Grainger to stay fully stocked on the products and supplies he needs, from tissues to disinfectants to floor scrubbers. All so that he can help students, staff, and teachers stay healthy and focused. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Bugs crashing your pack's party? Whether they've got paws or sneakers, your pack deserves a home that's protected from pests. That's where Wondercide comes in. Plant-powered protection made with steam-distilled natural essential oils that actually work. It kills and repels fleas, ticks, mosquitoes, and ants without questionable ingredients or overpowering smells. Safe to use around kids and pets when used as directed. Lab-proven to work fast. And proudly made in the USA. We offer sprays for pets, people, homes, and yards. Plus, spot-on treatments, collars, and even shampoos. Whatever your pack needs, we've got it covered. Founded by a pet parent looking for a better way to protect her dog Luna, Wondercide's now protected over 21 million lives and counting. You might have even seen us on Shark Tank. Go to Wondercide.com and use code WONDER20 for 20% off your first order. That's WONDER20 at Wondercide.com. Wondercide. Protect your pack with plant-powered Wondercide today.
Hello, filthy movie lovers. My name is Gentry Austin.
And I'm Casey Scott.
And we're the hosts of the Sin Syndicate, film podcast for something weirdos, anti-criterion bros, and Joseph Sarno aficionados. Join us semi-weekly as we peer into the adults-only theaters and sticky-floored cinemas of the golden age of sexploitation, when the morals were loose, the laws were murky, and the intercourse was all simulated. Find us now on the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Hey there, folks. This is Mike White coming at you with a special bonus episode of the Shabby Detective. On this episode, you're going to be hearing from Glenn Stewart. He is the author of Columbo Explains the 70s, a TV cop's pop culture journey. I am just so happy with how much Columbo scholarship has been going on over the last few years. It's really been very exciting for a fan like me. This is another one coming out from Bonaventure Press. Actually, it came out February 25th. It is available on Kindle as well as paperback and hardcover. Pick it up at your local bookstore if you can. Support the arts. And thank you so much for listening to this special bonus interview. Glenn, before I start asking you about Columbo Explains the 70s, what's the Glenn Stewart story?
Well, the brief Glenn Stewart story is that I spent 25 years in the radio industry across the country. Before that, I had graduated from Brown University with BA in political science. And so I didn't really use that for my first 25 years, but then I got out of radio and I went into teaching. And I was teaching history and I was working in education assessment. And I had kind of, I guess, the writing bug, but I didn't really have an outlet for it. And then I discovered the Columbo File blog several years ago. I'm assuming that a lot of your listeners are familiar with the Columbo File blog, and if they're not, there's a lot of great content that's there, a lot of great reviews of episodes. And I thought, well, gee, maybe I can try to contribute something to the Columbo File blog. And I gave the blogmaster CP, I gave him some material, and he was kind enough to use it. And he was using more and more of my material, but he wasn't able to use all the material that I was able to think of when it came to Columbo. Because I had watched Columbo when I was a kid, back in the 70s, and I kept coming back to it. And I realized I had a lot of material that wasn't going to make it to the blog, and so I thought the best thing to do would be to just get to it and write a book about it. And so here we are.
You said that you watched Columbo back when it was originally airing, I'm assuming. When did you really start to become aware of it? Because it's one thing for it to be just on television. You're not that old of a gentleman, so I don't know if you were necessarily choosing to watch Columbo or if it's something that your parents were watching. When did you really start to connect with the show?
Well, I was definitely choosing to watch it. I was fascinated by the plotting and the character and the gotchas that would nab the killer. I was all fascinated by that. But then it wasn't on streaming. There was no such thing as DVDs. In the 70s, you watched the show once, and then once you did, you weren't going to watch it again until it came on in the summer reruns. So a show like Columbo really does stand up to repeat viewings, which is why you can keep coming back to the show again and again and again. Back in the 70s, that was difficult to do. And then I would go away to college, and then years later, I would kind of rediscover Columbo and rediscover all the things that I missed the first time around when I was watching earlier in my life. And started to realize, oh, there's a lot of stuff here, because a lot of care was taken with Columbo in not just the characterization, but in the guest stars, the supporting actors, the music, the plotting, the sets, all the, what I call in the book, I call it the connective tissue that made Columbo such a great show. So that even if, let's say, a plot wasn't all that great, or you had an episode that really wasn't, hitting on all cylinders, like I'll pick an example, Old Fashioned Murder. You can still find elements to that episode that are pretty good because of the high level of craftsmanship that went into that show.
I love this mix of the political science that you were learning and that you learned, that you went to school for and everything. And then the idea of marrying that with Columbo. I mean, the title of the book, Columbo Explains the 70s, such a great title and such a brilliant way of taking the show apart in a different way than I've seen anybody else do it. I'm so glad we're in this almost like new age of Columbo scholarship, and Columbo Explains the 70s is right up there. I love your approach to this material.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I was watching episodes and I realized that a lot of what was going on was very much of the era. Because I grew up in the 70s and I kind of lived it, I was able to make those connections. And if you're watching Columbo today, if you're watching Columbo for the first time, or you're streaming it and you're kind of new to Columbo of the 70s, it doesn't resonate like that. But I think that Columbo was popular in the 70s, the character and the show, because it touched on a lot of the values of people of the 70s. And a lot of the social issues. So those issues might be something like, gender equality, women's liberation, class issues and conflict, power and authority, technology, violence. There's all sorts of issues that intersect with 70s Columbo. And if you know where to look, you can find those. And I like to think that my book provides a guide to that. And I also think that it also gives people another reason to rewatch the show. And I'm always looking for reasons to rewatch the show. And I hope that my book also provides people with reasons to rewatch the show and think, oh, Columbo says that right there. Yeah, that was a very 70s thing that he said right there.
I was so glad when you started one chapter off talking that quote from, I'm going to forget which episode it was, where the woman's talking about, I've tried est, I've tried, I'm okay, you're okay. All the self-help movements, just to really open up that idea of like, this is a contemporary show. Those things were terms at the time. And I really appreciated that you look deeper than just being like, oh, Columbo was a class warrior, and that it wasn't just class, that it was really more about the power. And I found that to be such a refreshing take on that whole angle of where Columbo was coming from.
Right. Thank you. I know that most people and most writers of Columbo, all the appreciations of Columbo, they always come back to the class element, the middle class public servant who's going after the rich and entitled killer. That's great. That's a part of it. And I get that. That's very satisfying when those people are brought down. But I think there's more to it than that. And I think you have to go back to look at what was going on in the late 60s and the 70s to really appreciate it. Because back then you had the Vietnam War, and it was very contentious back then. And you had a lot of people who were suspicious of what the government was telling them. And there was what was called the credibility gap between what the government was saying was going on and what was actually happening on the ground in Vietnam. Then you had things like the My Lai massacre being covered up by the government. You had in 1971 the Pentagon Papers from Daniel Ellsberg, and those get printed. And those papers are telling us that the government had certain motives and actions that they were doing in Vietnam that we didn't know anything about. So government is lying to us. Then, 1972, Watergate. And Watergate just brought it to a whole nother level of mistrust, and it cast a shadow over the entire 70s decade. So I come back to a catchphrase from the late 60s and early 70s that showed up on a lot of bumper stickers at the time, and that's question authority. And to me, question authority, that phrase is the key to Columbo. Because yes, he was going after rich people, but he was also going after powerful people, people with power and authority. And I don't necessarily mean just, political power, but powerful CEOs of industry, powerful professionals, people who are authorities in their field, food critics, art critics, concert conductors, actresses, country singers, people who are authorities in their field who get respect from everyone. And Columbo wanted to make sure that they lost their power and authority because they were killers. Now, a lot of times these people were rich, but at the end of the episode, Columbo's not interested in taking away the money of the killers. He's interested in taking away their power and authority. And the way I like to describe it is that Columbo was looking for the social injustice of people getting away with murder, not the social inequities of people trying to get away with capitalism. So that's to me, that's the key to really getting into the show.
Well, and the way that he does it with the disarming, the charm, the self put downs. And I really liked how you very specifically went through some of those examples as far as the lady lawyer will put him in a plane and then have control over him or have power over him that way. Or, it's just amazing to read all of those quotes as far as people, just a little slight put downs, like a person like you, Mr. Columbo, the Mr. to the Mr. Columbo, that is so crucial. And I hadn't ever really thought about that. Of course, you get those great speeches, oh yeah, you're trying this act and, I can see right through you. But the other ways that he charms and disarms and that the way that people use their power and put him down, I think that chapter really resonated for me.
Well, thank you. Yes, there's a dominance element to it, that Columbo is dominated by the killers, but Columbo also wants to be dominated. He opens up that door so that the killers think that they have an advantage on him. And I think that's really expertly done. And I know there's a lot of, and this is a good conversation to have as far as chatter about, is Columbo authentic in what he says to killers and how he's very humble? And is he an authentic character? And I think that most of the time he is. But I also think that he knows that he has an advantage to exaggerating some of these character traits. So that's what he'll do. He'll fumble around a little bit extra time for that pencil that he needs, or he'll do a little bit of extra sneezing when he's in the company of the killer, just to kind of invade their personal space and put them off guard. So I think there's an authenticity to his character, but not without just a little bit of exaggeration.
The coming into their personal space, that's wonderful. And I love his marveling around their technology. The term future shock hasn't been used for a little while. I remember what it means, and hopefully most of our listeners remember what it means, but he encapsulates that so well, and you really bring that to the fore as far as the use of the technology in those episodes.
Yeah, future shock was, I think people underestimate now how really important the Future Shock book was, and Alan Toffler's theories about the shattering stress of the consequences of too much technology too fast. And that was part of the decade. Yeah, Toffler was on all the talk shows, and the catchphrase made it into the Columbo episode, A Friend Indeed. So that tells you right there how important it was. And I think that that element of technology was in Columbo from the very beginning. So going back to the creators, Richard Levinson and William Link, I think that was always a part of their plan to have that part of the Columbo character. They created in 1967, before the Prescription Murder movie, they created the Mannix character. But Mannix was part of a huge detective agency in a gleaming skyscraper with banks and banks of computers and technology to help them fight crime. That show didn't work, so they had to change up that premise. But Levinson and Link took that concept and they just used it in Death Lends a Hand with Robert Culp as the villain. So Levinson and Link, I think, were on top of that from the very beginning. And then you have an episode, the first series episode, Murder by the Book, where Columbo is marveling at the fact that elevator buttons can register the heat that comes off your hand. I mean, no real reason for Columbo to say that. It's not a clue that has anything whatsoever to do with the episode, but it shows that Columbo is going to be very tied into technology. And he has to be, because that's part of his job. And so he walks us through, the viewer who might be a little scared of some of this new technology. He walks us through how to adapt to it, because he has to adapt to it himself. And my favorite example of this is in Exercise and Fatality, where he gets the phone number of Mr. Louis Lacey. And so this is the accountant who he wants to try to get some evidence from. And so he calls Louis Lacey at home. Phone picks up, says, "Hi, I'm Louis Lacey." Columbo starts talking to him as if it's a regular person, then is stunned to find out that it's an answering machine that's picked up. And Columbo doesn't quite know how to react. And so Louis Lacey leaves the message that every person in the 70s left at the end of their answering machine message, which was, "When you hear the beep, leave your message and I'll get back in touch with you." Now, that's very quaint today, but back then, 1974, a lot of people didn't have answering machines. A lot of people didn't know how to react to answering machines. And so Columbo, the funny part is that Columbo then talks very slowly, leaving his message. And that's the funny part, but it's also instructive. So it's how to interact with technology. That's a big theme throughout the 70s episodes.
That's a little bit about class, a little bit about technology. Also, we need to talk a little bit about some of the social movements that were happening back then when it comes to women's liberation, racial equality. I mean, those also get worked into the script as well. And again, I love especially what was the name of the chapter?
Yes, Liberation and Lady Killers. And the 70s for television and dealing with the women's liberation movement, that was a balancing act, not just for Columbo, but for all the shows in the 70s, because the women's liberation movement, feminism, gender equality, those issues were gaining steam. But it was very difficult for a lot of people to wrap their arms around those issues. And Columbo, the Columbo character, was one of those people. So if you equate feminism and liberation with being strong as a female character, Columbo had a lot of strong female characters, not just as killers. And we can point to Lee Grant, we can point to Vera Miles, strong female killers, but also strong supporting characters as well. And if you look at it from that way, Columbo is very progressive as far as having women of strength on the show. But the other side of it is that Columbo himself as a character has a tough time grappling with these new ground rules or how to deal with women. So he looks at a male secretary in the Bye Bye Sky High IQ case, and he says to the male secretary, "What is this, women's lib? Don't ladies do this work anymore?" He says to Leslie Williams, Lee Grant, in Ransom for a Dead Man, he says to an associate of hers, he says, "I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you can work for a woman." He says to the Valerie Harper character in Most Crucial Game, he says, "Oh, you'd be an ornament in any office." And it's like you listen to some of this now, it's like, ooh, it's very cringy. But it was totally representative of the times and how people would react to how pretty a woman was and how they would react to women who had a little bit of power. Now, the good news for Columbo is that we know that he has a kind heart. We know he's open to change. And we know that he believes in equal justice. So we like to think that, we like to agreeing that women might need to be a little bit more equal in the world. But again, this was a very contentious issue back in the 70s.
Let's talk a little bit too, as far as racial minorities. I mean, that it's very nice to see how it's not even an issue for him. And it's never really brought to the fore in a negative way as far as people of color, and just he treats everyone very equally, whether they be a killer or not. He will, treat people with respect, but it feels very genuine when it comes to minorities.
Yes, he really didn't have any one of those bones, in his body for that. I do think that overall Columbo did a good job of representing racial equality and advances in their characters, in a lot of the background characters that you would see. And in a lot of the crime scenes, you would have African-American detectives and fingerprinters and people milling around doing their job. And it was roughly in the same, and I did some counting of all these episodes to know that it's roughly the same percentage that African-Americans were being represented in society at large. Now, having said that, I think that Columbo could have pushed the envelope on this a little bit more. I think it's very good that Levinson and Link didn't want to have any African-American killers on Columbo because William Link has said this, he didn't want African-Americans represented as criminals. He didn't want to make that stereotypical judgment. And I think that's great for the first few years of the show. But once the Columbo formula was established, I don't think it would have been that bad to have a Sammy Davis Jr. or James Earl Jones type be a African-American killer. We wouldn't have all jumped to the conclusion that, they're stereotyping African-Americans. And I think that's great that they didn't want to have an association of race with being criminal. The flip side to that, I would argue, would be that we didn't get to see any Black individuals as rich, as powerful, as famous, or intelligent enough to craft some of these, intricate murders that Columbo had to deal with. And we didn't get to see an African-American character have a battle of wits with Columbo like, say, a Jack Cassidy would. And I think that was a bit of a missed opportunity. I get the sentiment where they're coming from, but I also think that envelope could have been pushed. I think they also probably could have had a African-American sergeant on board. Get rid of Sergeant Kramer for an episode and let's introduce a new sergeant to kind of have a one-on-one with Columbo. Columbo did talk to uniformed officers who were African-American, but they weren't really part of the fabric of the show.
Your Bob Disheys, your Dennis Dugan, having somebody along with him would have been really nice. I mean, those characters were few and far between. I mean, the times that Dishy comes back is always a pleasant, time, but yeah, let's switch it up a little bit.
And those characters are there just basically so Columbo can provide someone with exposition. So he's not turning to look at the camera and say, okay, viewer, here's what I think. He's talking to the sergeant, and then we're learning about how his mind is working.
We're about to record our episode, Last Salute to the Commodore, which doesn't have McGowan in front of the camera.
And Mike, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, I know. Pretty universal, right? Yeah. It's got Patrick McGowan involved, but it's behind the camera rather than in front of the camera. You write a lot about McGowan, and I'm curious what you see as, his influence, not just as an actor, but as a creative force and really working with Falk on this.
Well, before I get into Patrick McGowan, I should say that I love The Prisoner, and I love what McGowan did with The Prisoner, the show it aired in Britain in 1967. It was in the States in 68 and 69, and The Prisoner was groundbreaking, exciting. I loved watching The Prisoner. And I have a high regard for Patrick McGoohan. Having said that, for Patrick McGoohan and Columbo, I look at it in three different elements. There's the acting, there's the writing, there's the directing. In the acting, he was the villain on 4 episodes between the 70s and 90s. I thought he always did a superb job. Really very good job. Even in the 90s episodes, which I'm overall not high on, but McGoohan as an actor, I thought was spectacular, particularly in the 70s episode by Dawn's Early Light. So I have no problem with McGoohan, the actor. McGoohan, the writer and the director, mixed bag. I think that as a writer, he didn't really take a lot of writing credits, except for, I believe, for A Murder with Too Many Notes in the 90s. But any episode that McGoohan was a part of, he would always rewrite things in the script, even if it didn't show up in the opening credits. And I would point to an episode like Identity Crisis. I know that's not everyone's cup of tea, but I like what he did with some of the writing scenes in Identity Crisis. And I think he does a good job with that. I think his directing on the episode Identity Crisis was pretty good as well. But now we talk about some of the downside. And his directing in Last Salute to the Commodore is, in my humble opinion, it's dreadful, because he's encouraging to push Columbo and Peter Falk into areas that really, I think, are embarrassing and that don't serve the character very well and don't treat the viewer with intelligence. And in the same vein, there's directing in episodes like Murder with Too Many Notes in the 90s. Very, I think, poorly done, poorly conceived. And I think that his directing and his writing had some good elements, but unfortunately, I think it took the series in the wrong direction. Now, Peter Falk loved him. And I say, for better or worse, Peter Falk let Patrick McGoohan do pretty much whatever he wanted. It's just the way it is.
You mentioned the 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s episodes. And I know this book is called Columbo Explains the 70s, not those other decades, but I'm so curious, are there episodes that are redeemable, I guess is the word. In your opinion, are there any that carry on with that classic tradition from the 70s?
A small number. I would say that Columbo was much better suited to the 70s. He was much more relevant in the 70s than he was in the 90s. And I do spend a chapter talking about that just so I can point up the difference between the 90s and the 70s and how Columbo is really relevant to the 70s. I also just don't think the show was produced very well. I don't think the quality was very high. And I think that when you look at the 70s, you've got a number of episodes that are A grade, A or A minus. There's a lot of them. And unfortunately, in the 90s, I don't see any episode as being that high a grade. I see a small handful of episodes as being a B or a B minus grade. And if we're looking at what I think would be the best episode of the 90s, I know for a lot of people, it's Columbo Goes to College. I disagree. My favorite episode from the 90s, it's not perfect, but I think the best one is Butterfly and Shades of Grey. And that's because I like William Shatner. If you don't like the Shat, then you're not going to like the episodes that he's in. He pushes the envelope on his chewing of the scenery, but he knows that he's doing it. He does it with a wink and a nudge. And most importantly, Peter Falk knows it. And Peter Falk has great chemistry with William Shatner and their scenes together. And I think there are like 8 of them. They really milked it in that episode. It's great chemistry. It's great fun. That episode was written by Peter Fisher, who was a story editor in the 70s, and he wrote a lot of great Columbo's episodes in the 70s. So the story elements are in place there. Not a perfect episode. Like all the 90s episodes, it's way too long and has filler in it. But overall, I would put that as the best episode of the 90s for me.
You were a teacher for a while, and I'm curious, what do you think Columbo could teach some of these modern detectives? Who, if anybody, might hold a candle to him, or what do people need to go back and rediscover and really bring from the 70s back into the 2000s?
For the detectives of today and for prestige shows of today, I think they've learned a lot in the last 50 years of watching television and knowing what viewers respond to. I don't know that there's much that I could say about that, except that I would emphasize being intelligent. And I think that's the real key to Columbo of the 70s and its treatment of the viewer. It treated the viewer with intelligence. It was a smart show written by smart people, designed for intelligent viewers, so we can have intelligent conversations about it like we're having right now. And Columbo of the 70s treated the viewers intelligently. Columbo of the 90s, I don't think, learned that lesson. And the example I would give would be the difference in how they treated humor. And the humor of the 70s most often came from the characters around Columbo and how they were reacting to him. So the gold standard for me is the soup kitchen scene. Yeah, the soup kitchen scene is great in negative reaction. And people aren't laughing at Columbo. We're laughing at the reactions of Joyce Van Patten to Columbo. Now you compare that to a scene from the 90s, caution murder may be hazardous to your health. And you've got Columbo in the parking lot with the Wade Anders character played by George Hamilton, and they're doing bumper cars, and there's, back and forth and silly sound effects, and they're repeating their actions, and there's, painful grimaces and silly music. And Columbo of the 90s talked down to the viewer, and I think treated the viewer as less intelligent than it treated viewers in the 70s. If prestige television, to stay prestige, should be treating its viewers with intelligence, because that's what Columbo did.
First book, out of the gate, I think you nailed it. Is there something else? Do you have something else you want to write about, or more Columbo, or something else that you want to tackle next?
Yes, I do. Funny you should ask. It's not Columbo related, but it is television related. And right now I'm working on a book. We'll see how it goes. We'll see what kind of traction it gets. And it's about television in 1968 and all the different elements of connections between not just one show, but all of television in 1968, because that was a very contentious year and there was a lot going on. You had the Democratic National Convention, you had the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, you had shows like Julia, like Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, like the Smothers Brothers show. 1968 has a lot of material. And so I'm tackling that right now.
That sounds fantastic. I can't wait to read that. And yeah, I totally agree. 1968, 1969, the next year as well, with all of the political upheaval happening then. Such a tumultuous time and such an important time in the world, not just the U.S.
Yeah, I think that'll be something that would be very readable for people. So we'll see what happens.
I just have one more question for you. How much did you pay for those shoes?
Or you could ask, as Peter Falk did at the Dean Martin roast. So I think he asked Dean if his shoes were rented.
I'm so glad you write about that. And then also even going into things like McGruff the Crime Dog. Bravo, sir.
Well, thank you. I thought it was important to put Columbo in context because, again, Columbo's got a lot of new viewers, and they may not be aware. They may have been told, Columbo was very popular in the 70s. They may not be really aware of the context of how popular Columbo was in the 70s. So I try to do that at the beginning of the book.
Well, Mr. Stewart, thank you so much for your time. This has been great talking with you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the kind words, and I appreciate your having me on the podcast.
Hello, this is Chris Haskell from They Live by Film. For those that don't know us, Adam, Zach, and I, we built a podcast over the last 2 years that's a combination of film discussion from 3 very different perspectives, as well as industry interviews with the leaders in boutique Blu-ray and 4K community. We started with Dev Crocodile, but over time we've been lucky enough to speak with Arrow Video, Severin, Mondo Macabro, Vinegar Syndrome, Radiance, Indicator, most of the OCN partner labels. It's been a blast. You can find us wherever you podcast, and also actually recently as part of Someone's Favorite Production Podcast Network. We hope to see you online.
Hello, my name is Kevin Tudor, and I'm one of the 3 hosts of Almost Major, a film podcast dissecting many major indie studios and the films they release. Every week, myself, Charlie Nash, and Bryden Doyle discuss overlooked, forgotten, or bona fide classic indie films via studio-specific miniseries. We've previously covered numerous films from Artisan Entertainment, Lionsgate Films, and New Line Cinema. Titles including The Blair Witch Project, American Psycho, Dogville, But I'm a Cheerleader, Saw, Requiem for a Dream, and Ringmaster, you know, the Jerry Springer film. Anyways, we have a fun time every week and we hope you will join us. Subscribe to Almost Major wherever you get your podcasts. Now proudly a part of the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.